As the 75th session of the World Health Assembly prepares to deliberate on an international pandemic pact today in Geneva, a group of UN human rights experts have published a statement urging states to ensure that ongoing multilateral negotiations on this matter must be grounded on human rights. Joining me to explain the purpose of the assembly and the concerns tabled by the human rights experts is one of the signatories to that joint statement, Attiya Waris, who is an independent expert on foreign debt and human rights at the University of Nairobi. Attiya, thank you so much for your time and thank you for joining us. I mean, I think we can all recall at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic just the lack of coordination that there was amongst the states and the lack of unity between countries that really, I think, looking back on how everything sort of progressed, could have saved a lot more lives. And I wonder if the pandemic pact is, in fact, trying to escape something like that happening again in future pandemics.
Thank you very much, Ntokozo, for having us. We, as the independent experts involved in this process, have been deeply concerned by the actions that have been taken, but are continued to be worried about the facts that are being played out globally. So one of the things that we are saying is that the pandemic is not over. We are not in a we are not in a post-pandemic world, and it's really important that we maintain that position for now. Many people across the world have not even had their first dose, and in developing countries, many may have had one dose, but certainly not the second one. There is an absence of transparency and solidarity globally around issues of vaccine equity, around health issues. And although participation has been engaged with to some extent at the WHO and at the Assembly, there is a need to ensure that it's continued meaningful participation. And lastly, and very importantly, that crises cost money. And so there is a cost, and we need to ensure that resources are also allocated to it.
I mean, thank you so much, Attiya. Going into the second session, which I believe begins today, in fact, with delegates arriving in Geneva. What are some of the salient points that you absolutely feel as though need to be discussed as the pact is being sort of woven together to ensure that we are better prepared and have a better response in the case of future pandemics?
So there is a great document. The Human Rights Council in 2021 actually passed a resolution 4614, where there was a call to ensure that there is equitable, affordable, timely, and universal access of vaccines for all countries. This resolution for us is the underpinning of it, in addition, of course, to the International Convention, the right to health. Now, it is extremely important that we ensure that there is international cooperation and solidarity under this, and that there is the realization that the vaccines are needed globally and we cannot stop. We have not achieved equality, and we need to use this as the watershed moment to ensure that we have a people-centered approach and that we take this very historical and important opportunity to ensure that and reflect on these critical lessons that we're learning out of the COVID pandemic. Ntokozo.
I mean, you've highlighted the need for, equitable vaccine distribution. You've also highlighted just how much it did cost a lot of countries, particularly lower income countries, to actually deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Some quarters of the world who are a lot more cynical about the treaty have already started hashtags such as Stop the Treaty, already, sort of dispelling myths around the good that could likely come from such a pact. I mean, what's your response to individuals who feel as though countries would essentially be signing away, their sovereignty when it comes to public health care in their countries if they do, in fact, sign up to become signatories on the treaty?
Well, when it comes to negotiation of treaties and treaty laws, it's very important that every country makes their own decision. And when they're making the decision, they make a decision for the best for their people. But I think the most important underpinning of the deliberations at the World Health Assembly and at the WHO is that we are not looking at issues around sovereignty there. We're looking at issues of global access and equitable access to the right to health. And COVID actually has taught us that it is not just the right to health, it is the right to life. 6 million documented deaths. These are documented. We don't know how many others there may have been out there. So while I appreciate the arguments of state sovereignty, I think that, and we think that as human rights experts, that the value of a human life must be placed at the pinnacle of these decision-making processes.
You know, something else, Attiya, that the COVID-19 pandemic sort of exacerbated and made us even more aware of were the sort of lines of inequality, certainly in our own country, that we have had, you know, that are long-standing issues that we're still dealing with today. The levels of inequality in South Africa became that much more apparent during the COVID-19 pandemic. How would something like a global pandemic pact assist countries like South Africa and other lower-income countries or developing market countries in better handling pandemics? Because it does seem as though we're not going to get a one-size-fits-all solution from this treaty. And how do we ensure that individualized cases are also adequately assisted through this treaty?
So the treaty is not going to be the silver bullet. It never is a silver bullet solution in any case. But what it is it has created the opportunity for people to have this conversation at a global level. And this is why it becomes so interesting. So the intergovernmental negotiating body that was set up has been, for example, allowing for public participation. However, what we are not clear on is how is that participation going to influence the process? And I think for us, that is part of the big questions we've been having on issues of the negotiation of the treaty and what is going to be included in it and what's going to be excluded. We need clarity on participation. We need clarity on how it is going to be engaged with and also how states are going to be protected or not. And I think these are important considerations for them to look into. And we are hoping to, of course, encourage the debate and the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Attiya. You know, just lastly, you know, we've been talking a lot about the involvement of states, and you've said that you are seeking clarity on the issue of participation when it comes to, you know, the treaty itself coming together. But what of the private sector? I mean, when we look at issues like, you know, global warming, for instance, and climate change, we've seen that a lot of the responsibility has fallen on states to take charge on how they are ensuring, you know, that their countries are transitioning to, you know, greener power, less so on private sector companies, which are massive contributors to the problem. Are we likely to see a repetition when dealing with future pandemics? I mean, what responsibility are we placing on the private sector in helping countries be better prepared for future pandemics?
That is a tough question. We are also concerned about the role of private sector and access to essential medicines and services during crises and ensuring that businesses respect human rights. And this is also in our statement. Every single country in the world has its own rules and regulations guiding businesses. And while it is important always for us to have global rules as much as we can, so we have an agreed set of base principles on how businesses and people will behave in a whole series of spaces. What is and does remain state responsibility is also how they hold the businesses in their countries accountable. And this is a responsibility that we all share as global citizens, as states in the world. And I think we need to really reflect on that. There hasn't been enough of a reflection on it, and there hasn't been enough of a change in how businesses are operating during crises. And you are absolutely right. It's not only about the climate crisis, it's also the food crisis now that we're looking at, as well as other crises that are rippling across the world.
Attiya, well, thank you so much for coming onto the program and sharing your insights with us. That's Attiya Waris, independent expert on foreign debt and human rights at the University of Nairobi, talking to us there about the World Health Assembly delegates joining each other in Geneva there to discuss the pandemic pact. Up